Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that inspirational video. I'm now planning to work out right after we sign off of this event. I'm Leslie Lewis, and I'm an Executive Vice President on the Duke Alumni Association Board of Directors. And as many of you know, I live here in Colorado. We are so pleased you've all joined us for tonight's special webinar about the impact of COVID-19 on Olympic and Paralympic sport. And I am particularly excited about having the opportunity to moderate tonight's conversation, since I myself was a varsity volleyball athlete at Duke. Before I introduce our guests, I want to let you know a little bit about the structure for the evening. Our speakers will be in conversation with one another, discussing various topics related to our theme. Should you have questions for them, we ask that you submit those via the Q&A functionality you should see on your screen. We'll have a little bit of time at the end where I'll be taking some of those questions and directing them to the speakers. The event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Now I'd like to introduce our guests, Sarah MacDougall Hirshland and Nina King. Sarah graduated from Duke in 1997 and has dedicated her professional career to the marketing, development, and management of U.S. sports. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee and leads the organization in its mission to empower Team USA athletes to achieve sustained competitive excellence and well-being. Nina King is currently Duke's Senior Deputy Director of Athletics Administration, Legal Affairs, and Chief of Staff, which basically means she's the person you want to speak to or hear from when it comes to anything Duke athletics. Additionally, she teaches sports business administration in the Fuqua School of Business and will serve as chair of the NCAA Division I Women's Basketball Committee for the 2020-21 season. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sarah and Nina. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that warm introduction. It's great to be with everyone and great to see you, Leslie. Let me say a heartfelt thank you to our colleagues in Alumni Affairs and especially Duke, Colorado for hosting us tonight. I know that both Sarah and I are thrilled to be here having this conversation with all of our friends and Duke alums. So with that, Sarah, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too, Nina, and let me add my thanks to everyone for making time in your schedule to join us tonight. Incredibly fun for me to be able to blend my passion for Duke and Duke athletics with my professional life. So I'm excited to be here, and it's great to be with you and all the Dukies.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start our conversation and talk a little bit about you. Tell us about your time at Duke and how that really kind of influenced and shaped your ultimate career in sport.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I applied to Duke and was graciously accepted, I had a very clear plan that I was on my way to medical school to be a doctor in the field of sports medicine. I showed up on campus at Duke as an 18-year-old and ran my way to the athletic department and begged them to take me on a work-study program, and had the great fortune of being a student athletic trainer during all of my time. So Duke athletics was a very important part of my career. Fortunately, before I invested the time and energy in medical school, I realized that medicine and my personality were not made for each other. But I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to manage seeing people in pain and managing athletes in pain and seeing blood, frankly. So I learned some important lessons along the way. But it did expose me to the world of athletics in a way that grabbed me for life. I had an incredible experience working in the athletic department while I was in school. I did end up graduating with a degree in biology, and I did all the pre-med requisites. So I am incredibly interested in human performance and athletic performance as it relates to biology, but frankly pivoted and spent my career understanding and learning more about the sports business and sport administration. And I will say, from my first role out of Duke throughout the history of my career, the Duke Network has been an important part of it all along the way. So I'm hugely grateful.
That's great. I bet there's a lot of 18-year-olds that got to campus this past week thinking that their career path is going to go one way. It'll be great to talk to them 5, 10, 15 years out and see where that ultimately ended up. But funny how it all works out after you finish at Duke. Let's talk first kind of about the impact of COVID on the athletes themselves. I mean, obviously COVID postponing Tokyo 2020 was a huge, I think I heard you phrase it once as a punch in the gut to our athletes. Tell us a little bit how has the postponement of the Olympic Games impacted Team USA athletes?
Yeah, well, Nina, look, I think the first thing we have to remember is that for most of the athletes competing at the Olympic and Paralympic level, they have been dreaming of and preparing for a moment in time most of their lives. And then that moment changes. And so what's required is some pretty significant adaptation. And that adaptation is in a few ways, but first and foremost, very practically, these athletes had to change their coaching. They had to change their strength and conditioning. They had to change their nutritional programs. They had to change their sports psychology plans. And they had to adapt and rebuild a new plan for a new timeline. And frankly, as we all are doing now, continuing to adapt and modify those plans. Now we are looking squarely ahead. We celebrated our 1 year out milestone for the second time just recently, and the athletes now are back on a path where they have very clear plans to ensure that they hit peak performance at just the right moment in time. That requires a lot of people in our organization and across the sport community to be constantly looking at data, analyzing, and making sure that we've got all the aspects of their training dialed in perfectly. But it isn't easy, and you can imagine the toll it takes on them, both physically, but also mentally. So we've invested quite a bit in thinking about, mental resilience and mental health and how we manage and keep everybody in a good state, both physically and mentally, to peak at just the right moment in time next summer.
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of creative workouts come out of the postponement of the games. Do you have a favorite from Team USA that you've seen that you would like to share with us?
Well, I have to tell you, creativity is certainly a skill, and adaptation has been amazing. There's probably nothing I've seen that's more impressive and entertaining than Katie Ledecky, who is one of our country and frankly our world's best swimmers. Deciding to take a glass of chocolate milk, setting it on top of her head while she swims the length of the Olympic pool. Not a drop spilt. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to Google it. But what it shows, and certainly it shows the athletes' understanding of how important it is to bring fun and humor and creativity into their daily routines and their daily regimen, but also the creativity of figuring out how to refine skills in new and different ways. And that's a really important thing. Overtraining and consistency and repetition is important, but creativity is also important. So I would say Katie's probably right up there with the glass of chocolate milk. That's pretty good. But a couple other things I've seen, I'll tell you, plenty of athletes, particularly in the early days before people had a lot of time to set up makeshift workout environments, a lot of bench pressing couches. We saw quite a bit of that. I'll tell you, sport climbing is one of the new sports that will be in the games in Tokyo next summer. Sport climbing, for those who don't know, we call it mountain climbing, or often think of it as mountain climbing, but a new discipline in the games. And we have seen a couple of our sport climbing athletes climbing rock fireplaces inside people's homes that are 2 or 3 stories. Many of the mountain cabins out in the mountains have those. I do not recommend anybody try that at home. But for elite and professional climbers, apparently they're a good makeshift option. I think maybe the most creative, I'm not sure how effective thing we've seen, was athletes pouring dish soap in a bathtub to create a slippery slide environment. Sounds a little dangerous, but creativity abounds, no doubt.
That's great. I think one of the fun things that I saw was the Peloton workout with a lot of our Team USA athletes, and then just personally trying to jump on the Peloton and see where would I line up. Nowhere near any of those athletes, but that was a fun experience to watch on TV. And then watching Mark Spitz match Katie Ledecky swimming across the pool with a glass of water on his head. Still got it.
I will tell you, I spent a little time, one of our corporate and global partners has created some incredible Olympic experiences. And one of them was a physics lesson with one of our Olympic swimmers. And suffice it to say, physics was not my finest class at Duke. I suffered through it, but made it. It's not my strength, but I was pretty intrigued to understand the physics of swimming. And having gone through and listened to that experience, you understand just how well these athletes understand the science and technology of what they're doing in every single movement. And watching, the understanding of the less movement, the less water you move, the more effectively and quickly you're going to be able to move through the water, speaks to what Katie and Mark Spitz know very, very well.
Fascinating, for sure. For sure. Well, let's turn a little bit to the impact on the games themselves. The Japan Organizing Committee, all of the administrators, all of the folks that are working so hard to put Tokyo 2020, now 2021 on. Take us through a little bit. What's the impact there?
Yeah, well, in a word, challenging, as you can imagine. It truly takes a country, a government, and an entire nation to welcome the world for an Olympic and Paralympic Games. About 10,000 athletes and all of the entourage that comes with them. Plus you bring the media, the spectators, and all that comes around it. So it has been an incredible undertaking for the Japanese government. I will tell you, we're enormously grateful for their willingness to step in and say, we will figure out how to do this a year later. I'll give just one example that really struck home with me. In the Olympic and Paralympic Games, one of the unique and really incredible experiences is the creation of an athlete village, where all 10,000 athletes from 206 countries around the world come to live for 17 days together. It's a curated experience. It is very much built on the principles of universality and global connections and sportsmanship among nations, and so it's a very powerful experience. But putting 10,000 athletes in a single place is no small task. Tokyo spent many years building a series of buildings to serve as this athlete village. Those buildings are then turned into condominiums and places for their citizens to live. Well, you can imagine all of those condos were pre-sold, and there were 10,000 people intending to move into those buildings sometime next month. And so gracefully and professionally undoing those commitments and postponing them for a year is just one of the many tasks that Japan is facing. But I will tell you, the work is happening. They are taking it methodically, step by step. They've now released the schedule. All of the venues have been secured. And so, knock on wood, if we are able to safely compete next summer, I can assure you it will be an absolutely exceptional Games.
Wow, the things that you don't think about, the impact that this is all having, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, so if we do get to next summer, when we do get to Tokyo 2021, I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. Tell us, what can we expect from Team USA next summer?
It's the question everybody asks and that I'll never answer. But here's what I will tell you. Of course, we have extensive data and analytics, and we look at performances, and it will be interesting because typically the athletes during the stretch of time leading into a Games are competing on an international stage, preparing their competitive sort of styles, their experience on the competitive stage against the other best athletes in the world, all with the motivation to peak just at the right moment in time. That's obviously not happening right now. So it's a little harder for them to measure themselves against their peers in a competitive environment, which is a bit of a different change. So the analytics are going to be a little bit outdated, which will probably make it one of the most compelling competitions we've ever seen, because there will be lead-in competitions, there will be Olympic trials, Paralympic trials, but not degree that everybody is used to having that experience. That said, I will tell you that preparation is our goal. We always aim to be the most prepared country in the world when we take a delegation to the Olympic and Paralympic Games. All of you know that the difference between winning and not in that environment is a fraction of a second, a fraction of a centimeter. And so every detail counts. So we spend a lot of time on details, and I'll give you an example right now, and certainly over the course of the winter leading into the spring. We have here in Colorado Springs a high altitude training center, and it is essentially a training room environment in which we can control the altitude, the humidity, and the temperature to simulate any environment anywhere on the planet. Only on Earth, we can't do that from Mars, but we can do it on Earth. And we use that and have been using that a lot, particularly in those sports where athletes have to make a weight and compete in a weight class or at a weight level. The difference between what happens to their body in a Colorado Springs dry 6,000 elevation environment to a sea level, very humid, very hot environment in Tokyo is meaningful, and meaningful enough that we will invest quite a bit of time studying and managing and very carefully moderating things like their hydration levels, their nutrition, their training loads, and what that looks like, so that by the time we arrive in Tokyo, we have a pretty good estimate of exactly what's going to happen to them physiologically, and we're ready to manage through it. So lots of details.
Well, sorry, folks. I tried to get a prediction and a number out of Sarah, but didn't work.
Here's what I will tell you, Nina. A, we'll be the best prepared country in the world, and B, we will represent this country very, very well.
Love that. Love that. Well, let's talk about the impact of the pandemic on sport in general. I mean, it is pretty somber what this pandemic has done to our country, to the world, and so many different industries. But obviously, we're here to talk about sport tonight. So tell us a little bit about how has the pandemic affected your community?
Yeah, it's been challenging for sure. You know, we are organized, as many of you may know, we're organized into our organization, and then we partner with about 50 national sport governing bodies for each sport, whether it's USA Swimming, USA Archery, on down the line. And each of those organizations is critically important to the development and pipeline of athletes in those sports, from recreational on up to the most elite levels. Typically, competitions are being conducted in communities across the country, and all of those competitions ultimately ladder their way up to the best of the best, who we start to bring in and we start to invest in to become Olympic and Paralympic athletes and wear the country's flag and represent the nation. Those competitions, as you know, aren't happening. And so that is really significantly affecting both the pipeline and the development of young athletes, but also the revenue and the viability of some of these national sport organizations. So it's a challenging time for everyone, for sure. And, you know, we see trends that are disheartening and concerning. Absolutely, you know, the notion of, as funding is called into question, municipalities pulling back funding, school systems pulling back funding for sport. It's a real challenge for all of us. And so, you know, I view it as part of my obligation and duty, and I'll do it on this call if you'll give me a minute to get on a soapbox. But it is really important that we all advocate for sport. As we think about recovery, as we think about go forward, sport is such an important part of human performance and human development. And it's an incredibly powerful tool to unite and build community. And I just, you know, we would not want to live in a world or a society without it. And I hate for any of us to take it for granted. There is no doubt on a global stage, we are the envy of the world as it relates to sport in this country. But it's more threatened than it's ever been right now. And so we do have to be very diligent and advocates and make sure that we recognize, you know, each of our Olympic athletes started in a pool or a gym or on a field or on a court or on a slope somewhere, and those businesses are struggling. And so we're all going to have to do our part to make sure we keep sport strong.
For sure, for sure. I think we're also seeing that at the collegiate level, and sports being threatened at the collegiate level. A lot of colleges and universities are dropping sports right now. And so trying to maintain that pipeline, so many of our student athletes go on to become Team USA or other countries' Olympians. And so we are trying like crazy to protect the integrity of our Olympic sports at the collegiate level, especially.
No question, it's important. I'll give you an interesting stat. I went back and looked at the research from our 2016 games in Rio de Janeiro. A full 10% of the athletes who competed in that games were trained and attended NCAA institutions. Those are not all US athletes, but a full 10% of the athletes that competed came out of the NCAA system. So it is a really, really essential part of the Olympic and Paralympic system, not just for our country, but for nations around the world. So it's important, and we're all keeping very focused on it and working. Frankly, I spend a good bit of my time in working with folks in Washington, D.C. to ensure that as they're thinking about stimulus and as they're thinking about societal issues, they understand the value of sport, not just as a tool for physical health and wellness, but frankly, as a tool for the development of individuals and communities.
Yeah, wow. Well, you touched a little bit, you mentioned mental health. There is a great focus on providing mental health services for collegiate athletes, and we have been really honed in on that at Duke and bolstering that area, that service that we provide for our 700 plus student athletes. But tell me about some of the initiatives around mental health at the Olympic level.
Yeah, it's really important, and there are a few aspects. We've created a mental health task force to guide and steer the organization, really as an advisory council for me and my team, to make sure that we're looking at it from all angles. And some of that is preventative, just the realities of mindfulness and mental health that all of us can be considering and thinking about on a day-to-day basis, but becomes incredibly critical for the athlete community. So you think about mindfulness training, you think about managing anxiety and stress, you think about, we're now in a position where we do a lot of athlete monitoring so that we're matching how an athlete tells us they're feeling with how we're managing training. And we're in the early stages of this, but as we get better and better at this, we're going to be able to really take biological feedback, emotional feedback, and start to marry those two things to optimize and maximize our individual performance in a day-to-day basis. I don't even mean athletic performance, just human performance. Some days we're on and some days we're just not. So those are important things. And then there are also the issues of true mental illness and managing through what can be very, very challenging circumstances that can be exacerbated, frankly, by sport and elite sport and the pressure that comes with it, whether that is things like eating disorders, addiction, or just anxiety, depression, things of that nature. So we are also really focused on making sure that we have a provider network of expert clinicians who can manage and help our athletes manage through those difficult environments. One of the key pieces of this, and the stakes in our world get high for an athlete pretty quickly. And so they don't want to show any sign of weakness along that pathway for fear of that, looking bad or being a check in the wrong column on their ability to make the team, which is highly competitive. And so we're creating a structure that ensures that they have the ability to seek the mental health and support needs that they have outside of the sport performance system to separate those two things. And, Michael Phelps in his recent film said it as well as I can say it, which is it's okay to not be okay. And we need athletes to make sure that they feel like it's okay to not be okay and to seek that help and assistance. It's a stigma, and frankly, that's true for all of us. It's not just true for athletes. So our goal and our objective here is to create an ecosystem where we can lead and where athletes who have the bully pulpit and have the voice and have the influence can tell stories that will help destigmatize mental health for people around the country, and that we can help societally move the needle on this really tough issue. But it's a journey, and we're going to be on it for quite some time.
Definitely agreed. And as you can imagine, I mean, Duke students have the added pressure, being a Duke student and a Duke student athlete, and trying to compete and be successful, do really well at both, is such a challenge for our student athletes. And so we are monitoring the landscape and providing, again, that service for our student athletes so that they can be successful and do both well.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think if we can create good habits as people are coming through the collegiate system, and frankly, as young people, that's a great thing. As they age, it will create generational change. And I think we're working really well together as a sport community to start to do that.
Yes, definitely agreed. Well, probably, I think it's about a year now that the USOPC changed the name of the organization. And I frankly wonder if some people kind of look at it now and say, what is USOPC? So take us through the name change that happened last year with the organization.
Yeah, Nina, thanks for asking that question. It's probably in my, this week is actually my 2-year anniversary with the organization. And in my 2 years, it's certainly the thing I'm most proud of. And it's as simple as changing the name, but as we know, everything is in a name. It was a very, very important signal to the Paralympians in our country and to all athletes with disabilities to say, we see you, we hear you, and we believe you're equal. And it was a step that needed to be taken. We have been, we're actually, interestingly, only one of 4 countries in the world that manage, as an organization, a single organization that manage both Olympic and Paralympic sport. In most countries, those are managed separately, but we manage them in an integrated way in this country. Paralympics certainly has developed later than the Olympic movement did, and it is something that is growing more recently for sure. And so it was a little bit overdue for us, for our name to reflect what our organization does, and for us to give the credit to the Paralympic athletes that there is a distinction between the Olympics and the Paralympics, and that we don't view them as second-class citizens, which, as you can imagine, not being in the name, many of them felt a little bit like that was the statement we were making. So it was something we wanted to fix, and frankly, it has been not only well received and really important in creating momentum for us here in the United States, but we've also seen it generate a meaningful conversation globally. And it's humbling to me. We are leaders, not only in the world, but in sport. And so what we do and what we say does get noticed, sometimes for better or worse, but in this case, it was for better. And we started a conversation around the world that I think has captured the attention of understanding and acknowledging better integration between the Olympics and Paralympics. The IOC has been in front of us and at our side, also working to integrate some of the work they do with the IPC, which is the sister organization, if you will, on the Paralympic side. So it's been really important. We're seeing great momentum. There's nothing that makes me more happy than to be sitting watching television and seeing a Paralympian show up in a commercial and knowing that the corporate community is also starting to support these athletes in a meaningful way. Certainly our philanthropic community has been incredible. And for those on the call who have never engaged deeply in the Paralympics, I promise you will never regret a minute spent in that space. It is absolutely an awesome, awesome display of sport. So we're proud of it, and we've got a long road ahead of us. But with the Olympic Games coming back to the United States in 2028, we have an opportunity to introduce the world to the Paralympics in a way that we didn't have back in 1984 when they didn't host a Paralympic Games. So LA's going to get a shot at it this time, and we're going to make sure that the way we think about people with disabilities in this country has changed forever.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for leading the way there. It makes me proud to be able to say USOPC.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Well, 2 years at the USOPC, that's amazing. Congratulations.
And you're still standing?
Yes, you are. You are. Besides the pandemic, what would you say has been the most surprising part of your role?
That's a really good question. Having spent my career in sport, but predominantly focused domestically here in the United States, I think the universality of sport has been really compelling and a little surprising to me in that regard. The first time I sat in a room, there are 206 countries that participate across the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And all of those countries have, you know, a leader of their National Olympic Committee who is my peer. And the first time I sat in the room with all 206 of my peers, and we sat to talk about, you know, how are we, the purpose for all of us here is to create a better, more inclusive world through sport. And you sit in a room with people from 205 countries, and you've got, you know, translators in 8 different languages talking about absolutely the same issues is a pretty humbling and amazing experience. And while I think I understood that this was, you know, representing the US on a global stage, I'm not sure I fully understood or could take in the magnitude of what that really meant. There are not a lot of things in this world that span the globe and can truly unite and unify people no matter where they're from. I think music is one, and sport is probably the other. And so it's pretty awesome and pretty humbling to be able to work in a space where you can feel and see that unity in a pretty powerful and incredible way. I'm not sure I hope I never get over that.
That's pretty cool, pretty cool. How about a favorite country that you've visited? I'm sure you've been all over the world in the past 2 years. Is there a favorite place?
It's a good question. I will admit, when I started this role, I did get a map of the US and said, I'm gonna start putting the pins in the map as I go. And so, you know, I'm marking things off. We had the World Beach Games in Qatar last year. That was my first trip to the Middle East, and it was amazing. And so that was probably the most incredible. I've been, as you can all imagine, I've been to Japan a number of times now. My daughter lives in Tokyo, so it's kind of fun for my husband and I to be staring at a games in Tokyo at a time when our daughter lives over there with her husband and their child. So that's been really fun and cool. But I have to say the trip to the Middle East was an amazing experience, both culturally and from an athletic and competition perspective. We took a delegation for that, about 150 athletes from the US to compete. So pretty cool. And it was pretty warm.
I bet. That's neat. Well, I'm sure there's a handful of folks, probably a lot of folks on the call that have not been to an Olympics. So for any of us that would be heading towards an Olympics anytime soon, for rookies, what would you say is a must do when you move towards the Olympic experience? What should we do?
So I think the first thing you have to do is this is a shameless plug for our website, but I'm going to get to the point, is really go and look at all the sports that are on the competition slate, because there are so many things that each of us knows the most common, or the ones that we've seen the most, and those are probably a little different for different people. But the reality is there are some sports being competed in the games that are really unfamiliar for the vast majority of Americans. They're sports that may be quite popular in other countries and less popular here in the United States. So I really view the Olympic and Paralympic Games as an opportunity to expand your sport horizons. Think about the things you want to watch, that you know, the athletes you love, all of that's really important. But use it as an opportunity to expand your horizons and learn about a new sport, something that you may not know as much about. Learn a little bit about the rules. I'll tell you, I have the benefit of sitting on what the International Olympic Committee calls the Program Commission. It is a commission made up of individuals from around the world in a decision-making capacity to evaluate and determine what is on the program. Right? What are the sports that will be competed at each games? And so, you know, as I joined this commission last year, the first thing I said was, well, what's the history? The history of how it's evolved over time is really interesting, but more importantly, it continues to evolve. They continue to add new sports, and they continue to change disciplines as sports evolve over time and become, in some cases, it's a little more TV friendly, a little more spectator friendly. We know that today's generations likes things in short, snackable bursts more than lengthy. And so there are sports that are evolving the way they do things for those things. So My urging to those who are new to this experience is expand your horizons and make the time to go watch something that's a little bit new to you, because you'll really enjoy that experience.
Well, maybe last question, kind of pivot or following up on that. What are some of the new sports in 2021? You mentioned fireplace climbing or sport climbing.
Sport climbing. Right.
But what are some of the other new sports that are coming to the Olympics this coming year?
So in Tokyo, we have surfing will be contested, skateboarding will be contested, sport climbing, and I feel like there's one other that I'm not thinking of right now, and I can't remember what it is. It may come to me. But those are three.
3-on-3 basketball.
Well, 3-on-3 is within USA Basketball, so yes. But yes, 3-on-3, which actually is really fun to watch. So our 3-on-3 basketball teams are preparing themselves as we speak, which will be really fun, and I'm optimistic that we're going to be pretty good there too. So yeah, that's a good one.
I have a bias towards that one because, as you know, our new head women's basketball coach is the 3-on-3 women's national. We have another tie to Team USA at Duke, which is exciting.
She is, and I'll tell you, she was with us in Lima last summer for the Pan American Games and the Parapan Games. She coached the 3-on-3 teams down there who did quite well. We had a ton of fun. You can imagine I was super excited when I saw that she was going to Duke. So you're right, that's an awesome connection.
That's great. Well, we're excited for Coach Kara.
Yeah.
Well, with that, Leslie, why don't you come back to us and let us know if there have been some fun questions?
Oh, yeah. We have lots of questions, and we won't be able to get to them all. But what I'm going to try and do is we have some related questions that we can group together and that cover a few different areas that you've talked about. This has been fascinating. I could just listen to you forever. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much. We had several questions around finances, and starting from what kind of support does the federal government give the USOPC? And then there was a note that our government does not give athletes support. And then another question about how do we support our athletes who have financial issues supporting themselves? So it's kind of a chain of finances. So I thought I'd group them all together so you could kind of talk about that chain, if that makes sense.
Sure, happy to. It's a great question. And the reality is we're one of, if not the only country in the world whose Olympic and Paralympic program is not supported by the federal government.
Right.
So it's a very different structure here in the US than what they see around the world. Many know in most countries, the government supports sport through what is sort of readily known or called a sport ministry. And sport tends to be regulated and sort of organized and financially supported through that sport ministry. It's not a structure we've ever had here in the United States. I will tell you, we have many other structures that have done incredible things in creating, a sport country that's amazing and frankly leads the world, but it is fragmented. And so there is real fragmentation. And what that does for us on the Olympic and Paralympic side of things is it creates a real financial hurdle for us to try to constantly overcome and frankly to stay competitive. So that is accurate that we don't receive funding from the federal government. I will caveat that by saying when we host a games, the federal government will step in and provide real support and assistance, because when you're bringing the world, the magnitude of that is very different. So there's been real support back in Atlanta when we hosted Salt Lake, and when we host LA again. We cannot do that without the support of the federal government in a meaningful way. But I will tell you that support is really more safety, security, those sorts of things than it is the financial backing to conduct the games. That is on the private sector as it is for us on a day-to-day basis. So we are financed entirely by what I would describe as the private sector, a combination of corporate sponsorship, corporate support, the broadcasting revenues that we share from the IOC. So a bit of a misperception, we don't own a games. We don't conduct an Olympic Games. We are guests of the International Olympic Committee as one of 205 countries, but we do share in revenue generated from those games. And the broadcasting revenue generated by the games is a very, very important revenue stream, particularly in the United States. And so we do share in that revenue with the IOC. We share in global corporate sponsorships, and then we share in our own, we have our own domestic sponsorships. So the corporate community is critical to our success. In fact, it is essential for our survival. And then we have an incredible, robust philanthropic program, and we do a ton of fundraising. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our purpose is to take a delegation to achieve sustained competitive excellence and well-being of the athletes that wear the flag of our country. And so we raise funding from the private philanthropy community, and I will tell you, that community has been incredible and generous and continues to really step up. All of that said, we do not have the ability financially to pay athletes a salary. There are athletes who receive stipends to help with living expenses. We do provide an enormous amount of training, resources, and support, but we are not in a position where we have, you know, the kinds of salaries and things that you see in professional sports. We just don't have the funding to do that. So it is financially a very, very meaningful and significant sacrifice for an athlete to decide that they're going to make full-time training a commitment and try to figure out how to fund their ability to live and survive while they do that in preparing for an Olympic Games. So you can imagine the COVID-19 environment. Many of our athletes who had second jobs lost those jobs. We did create a COVID Athlete Assistance Fund and are currently generating resources and asking people to donate and contribute to that fund to support these athletes with things as simple as rent and car payments, because many of them barely get by.
Yeah. I'm wondering, you know, you talked about the creativity in terms of workouts. So I'm imagining that the athletes are pretty creative in terms of their ability to find ways to fund themselves. What
they are.
Do you have anything, a little interesting story about any?
Well, I'll tell you, as I said, there are some corporations have been incredible at finding creative ways to employ athletes on a part-time or flexible basis to allow them to train. So that's been wonderful partnerships. There are absolutely athletes who have individual or what I would call personal sponsors, you know, individuals who have said, I'll help you. There are absolutely athletes work really hard to generate dollars through speaking engagements. A lot of them are motivational speakers. You can imagine their stories are incredible. So they're very good. Their skill sets and they understand the skill sets that they have to achieve what they achieve at the Olympic and elite levels. The determination, the persistence, the resiliency, you know, they have the ability, some of them, to knock you off your seat with a motivational talk, and they generate resources doing it. So that's a real source of revenue for some. Many have endorsement deals, and we encourage, you know, the corporate community to support the athletes because it's so important. So there are a number of ways that everybody tries to cobble together. There's nothing I would like more than to be able to put more money in the pockets of our athletes along the way, and it's something that we're working really hard to figure out how to do more of and how to generate more athlete earnings for these folks, because it's a challenging environment and it is a sacrifice for some. And, you know, I've said many times, my goal would be for there never to be an athlete who is talented enough to compete at the Olympic level that doesn't because they don't have the funding.
Yeah. Well, Nina, did you want to add something? Okay, I saw you nodding your head. I thought, oh, she's got something she wants to say. Hold on just a moment. So this ties a little bit into one of the very first questions we received, which was about Stanford dropping 11 Olympic sports. And you did touch a little bit on, you know, that it's very important to keep these sports going. As I listened to you talk about finances and all of the ways different sectors are pulling together to make this work, it seems to me the question was, you know, what do we need to do to prevent if other universities follow suit? What do we have to do to prevent that outcome? You know, universities pulling out of the Olympic sports and dropping those sports programs. And as I listen to you talk about the creativity and the way in the US these things work, I'm wondering if that isn't also related to this particular question of how do we prevent the dropping of Olympic sports from programs and universities. Do you have any more that you want to add about that?
Well, I'll comment and then I'll let Nina, who's clearly, you know, close to this from a collegiate perspective. The comment I would make is, you know, as I said earlier, we all have to understand and recognize the importance of sport as part of the human experience. In the case of collegiate athletics, as part of the student experience. It is not just for fun. It is an incredible development tool for human beings and for communities. And so we have to understand the value proposition for sport and make sure that we're investing in that value proposition as part of the experience. It's a critical piece of the puzzle, and that's at every level, you know, at youth levels, in the school systems. You know, what we can't have happen is a world in which the only people who have the ability to have access to sport programs are those with significant financial means. And there's a real risk of that in our country right now, because the accessibility for all is threatened by for-profit businesses, particularly when you get into youth and elite and, you know, elite youth travel programs and things of that nature. There are a lot of businesses and companies that are making very nice profits in those types of programs. But what it's done is starting to replace the investment that municipalities are making and that education systems are making and things like that. And at the end of the day, that's not the right answer for sport. So I would say we have to think differently about the role of sport in society and accessibility overall. And ideally at the university level, you think about it as an integral part of a student experience. So Nina, I'll let you comment further.
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly it. I mean, the value of the student athlete experience is one that we're incredibly proud of at Duke and at schools around the country. You know, we have 27 sports at Duke. We count 24 of them as our Olympic sports, so minus football, men's and women's basketball. And again, we're really proud of the broad-based Olympic sport programming that we are able to provide for over 700 student athletes at Duke. You know, the Olympic sport programming facilitates the student athlete pathway to national team representation. And that's a very important part of sport in our country. And so we work really hard to enhance the narrative around collegiate, Olympic, and Paralympic sport programming on campuses. You know, Stanford had to make a very hard decision, and we've seen a lot of athletics programs around the country cut sports during COVID, and those things are very hard. I mean, you have alumni who had wonderful experiences, you have current student athletes whose experiences are being impacted, and it is a very hard decision to cut a sport, and it impacts a lot of student athletes, coaches, staff, and those things never go well. Very, very difficult decisions.
Yeah. Well, I really love the emphasis on what sport does for human development. And I think that's a great frame, and people can start to think creatively about that and how that's implemented. So thank you for those comments. We had another set of questions around mental health, and you talked about mental health and the support for mental health, but I thought a very interesting question was talking about what about support for the athlete once they've completed competition? You know, that drop off can be it's like you fall off a cliff because you've been working towards this moment in time, as you talked about. That's why everybody's having to change up their sports psychology programs and their training, because they were training for a moment and now that moment is a year out. So same thing, when that moment is over with, what kind of support are you all offering to the athletes?
Yeah, and Leslie, you ask a really important question, and I'm afraid I have to agree with the way you describe it, which is there comes a point where you feel like you're standing on the edge of a cliff. And so our goal and motivation is to make sure that that's a nice, steady smooth hill and not a cliff. And actually, the experts that we've been talking to in the mental health space have reiterated to us over and over again the importance of trying to begin that conversation well before you're standing on the edge. That can be very challenging to do.
Yeah, sure.
And so one of the important tactics and things that we're talking about is how to make sure that it's the environment around the athletes that are encouraging and allowing for that conversation as well. Sometimes that's parents, sometimes coaches, it could be peers or alumni. Many of the athletes look up to those who came before them. And so a mentoring, type of environment where you get someone who can help you recognize that while you don't have to make decisions and have your next plan in place, you need to recognize that this is a journey that has a beginning and a middle and ultimately an end. And what does that look like? And how do you put yourself in a position to be ready for that and begin to think about what those next steps are? We have a program at the USOPC that we call ACE, which is our Athlete Career and Education Program. Something that we've had in place for some time and we continue to grow and make investments in, particularly as we think about that life transition. So partnerships where you're offering educational resources, and I'll tell you, during COVID, we've seen an uptake in our ACE programs that's significant because the athletes have time. They're not traveling, they're not competing. So in between their daily training, we're seeing athletes invest in online coursework. We're seeing them reach out to do things like taking SATs or GMATs or LSATs and doing that training work now. And we're also seeing them reach out to our ACE team and start to build resumes and having conversations about how do I talk about the skills I've developed as an athlete. So that's promising. But I will tell you, we have a very, very long road because it is difficult to start to focus on those things when you are laser focused on a goal and an outcome. And so all of us are going to have to work together to figure out what is the right way to encourage and make sure that you're providing a pathway that is both smooth on the way up and smooth on the way down.
That is great to hear about the ACE program. I'm glad to hear people are using it. Here's a very specific question that came up, and I thought it was a good one. For events in which the trials had already been completed, and they gave marathon as the example, will those winners still be the 2021 team, or will there be new trials next year?
So I wish that were a really simple answer, and it's a little complicated, but I'll do my best to try to answer.
Well, we'll hear whatever you have to say.
Keep in mind, we have, a lot of sports, a lot of different teams, a lot of different disciplines. So there's no one size fits all answer to that question, but here's the gist of it.
Okay.
A number of athletes qualified for the Tokyo Games by name. That's how I'll say it. If you are an athlete who qualified by name for these games, you are qualified. You're in, your status does not change. There are also a number of sports in which we as a country have qualified by what I'll describe as by quota. So by status of our country, we know we have spots in the games, but we haven't yet determined who from the United States will hold those spots. So in that instance, there absolutely are trials and a qualification process to happen. Not all sports conduct a single trials event. Some do, others have an ongoing series of competitions that lead to a ranking system or something like that. So it is varied sport by sport. The third category I would say is where we have neither qualified by name nor qualified by quota, and we still have a lot of work to do to earn our spots. So all three of those situations are out there. And we are, as you can imagine, we have a lot of people in our organization making sure we're on top of how to make sure we get every spot we can get. So for some, there's less stress. For others, the stakes are still quite high.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question that I actually don't know much about, and I'm going to see if you know about it. We have a question about how has the pandemic affected the refugee Olympic team? If you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit. We just have a few minutes, but maybe you can elaborate.
Sure. And I'm afraid I don't have a lot of specificity, but I will just say there is, the IOC supports a refugee team for athletes who don't have the ability to compete for a country.
Oh.
The issues of who you compete for and all of that can be complicated, but suffice it to say there is an outlet for those athletes who do not have the ability to compete for a country, but who have the talent and deserve to be there. And so the IOC has supported a refugee team. I can assure you there are individuals who are going to be on that team that might not have been there before COVID. Of that, I am unfortunately certain. The good news is the IOC is committed to that, and they have done a wonderful job of trying to facilitate training environments for those athletes. We have welcomed some of those athletes into our country to help them train in some of our venues, and many other countries have done the same. So it's a global movement to ensure that where there are individuals who don't have that avenue, we come together as a world and try to provide that avenue for them. I don't have a lot more detail than that, but it's a great program.
Thanks. What is the best place for people to monitor to stay up to date with plans for the 2021 games?
Well, teamusa.org.
All right.
teamusa.org. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. Team USA is not hard to remember. So we're everywhere you can find. We post great stories, good content, and we're counting on all of you to watch and cheer us on.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for this rich and informative conversation. I have learned so much. I want to thank also our tireless DAA staff for coordinating and supporting this event, especially Anne-Louise Aguiar, Mark Winans, Ryan Chung, and Sharon Elliott. And thank you everyone for joining. We had a couple hundred people joining us, which is fantastic. Remember that it was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody, and hope to see you soon at another Duke event. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.